Hello, Abe students. Mr. Harrison here at La Follette High School. Robert M. Fighting Bob, La Follette High School, right before elections. Here to talk a little bit about populations, Unit 3. Unit 3, we're going to break down into 3 ed puzzles. You can see number 9, which you're looking at right now, having to do with generalists versus specialists, K selected, R selected, and survivorship curves. Mainly dealing with non-human populations. At puzzle 10, we're going to do a little transition. Carrying capacity, we're going to talk about many different species, population growth and resource availability, and then kind of shift gears into talking about human populations in regards to age structure diagrams, total fertility rate. You can see human population dynamics and demographic transitions. One of the things you're going to notice is the skills they're going to be working on are a little different than the first 2 units. We're going to be looking a little more closely at looking at data. So you can see describing patterns or trends in data, explaining what the data implies, explain patterns and trends again. So these are all having to do with practice 5, which is data analysis. That will be something we'll be working on. You can see this time frame for Unit 3 is a little longer than the first 2 units because it has a little more weight with the AP exam. All right. So our instructional purpose is to introduce Unit 3 populations and distinguish between the niches and growth rates of different species. Excuse me. We're going to use lecture. We're going to do some FRQ and some multiple choice in this unit. And why is because we want to distinguish population growth rates of different species so that we can conserve biodiversity. We can also manage populations of things like invasives. So population ecology is really important. And when we get into human ecology, it's going to have, or human populations, it's going to have a significant impact when we talk about things like ecological footprint. So if you want to bring your grade up or prep for exams, please come and study to a study session 1 p.m. on Wednesdays. And I want to encourage you all to do that. Okay, to begin with, I want to talk about a problem I was having at my house. And it was flies. We started to see flies in our house. And this was going on almost a year. You'd see this ebb and flow of fly populations in our kitchen. And it was really, kind of bothersome, kind of pesty. And we were pretty good about trying to clean our house and try to figure out what was going on. And I did some research. This is Mosca domestica. This is the minor housefly, actually. And it's one of the most widely distributed species in the world, and it is a major pest. Eventually, we were able to discover that they were breeding in our rabbit hutch in the litter, and so we got more diligent about changing that, and actually took the rabbits outside for a bit, and the problem went away. So we had a lot of flies for a little while, and I started thinking about what would happen if a problem here in the United States wasn't flies, but I lived in somewhere like China. I had a problem with too many pandas. Like you never hear about that, right? Too many pandas. You've got all these pandas in your house. They're causing problems. They're knocking things over. Maybe they're making a mess. I mean, they'd be really problematic. And to eradicate them would be very difficult. You'd probably need heavy machinery and laser beams possibly to get rid of those. So why am I telling you these stories? Because here we've got 2 species that are dramatically different. And that's really the storyline here with 3.1. We're going to be talking about specialist species and generalist species. And then 3.2, we're going to be talking about what are called R-selected species and K-selected species. At the end, you should be able to tell me which one is the panda and which one is the fly. So learning objective. Identify differences between generalists and specialists. We're going to be looking at the specialist species tend to be doing best when habitats remain consistent, while generalist species tend to be advantaged when habitats are changing or disturbed. Um, so specialist species, here's our panda, have a very narrow range of tolerance, much smaller range of tolerance. Their niche is very specialized in terms of what food they access, what is their habitat requirements, and they're much less adaptable to disturbances. The general species here, we've got a raccoon. They have a really wide niche, very adaptable species, can tolerate lots of disturbances, and highly adaptable and less prone to extinction. You can see there is some niche overlap here, but this is probably not true. A panda and a raccoon would never really see each other or interact in terms of their niche. It gives you an idea graphically how the two are different. It's important to note, and all these terms we're going to be talking about, is there is a continuum, meaning species aren't necessarily one or the other. So I'd like you to spend a few minutes looking here at distinctions between specialists and generalists. I'm not going to list them all, but I'd like you to just kind of make a distinction because I will be asking you some questions about distinctions. I want to talk a little quick, and one example is the northern spotted owl. And that was a species I actually hooted. It kind of goes like this. And we'd hoot these owls and we'd have them come in, and we would give them a mouse and find where they would go and nest. And that was old growth forest and the Pacific Northwest. And they were a specialist species. It would only exist in those particular ecosystems. Anytime there was a disturbance of the forest, the spotted owls would move out. In contrast, their cousin, the barred owl, which goes was very abundant in disturbed habitat. So a kind of a contrast story of two species that superficially look a lot alike, but were very different in terms of their habitat and their niche. Okay, now it's your turn. What I'd like you to do is identify one example and a characteristic of a specialist species and explain how that characteristic makes them more likely to become extinct than a generalist species. And I don't want you to use the spotted owl or the panda. I'd like you to find another species. You can do some research. Spotted owls, by the way, are a threatened and endangered species and are in trouble in terms of susceptibility to extinction. Okay. All right. 3.2, K-selected and R-selected species. So we're going to be distinguishing between these two groups, much like we just did with generalist and specialist. Examples here, elephant. We're going to talk about K-selected, R-selected, spider, for example. So our objectives, essential knowledge and skills, you can see identifying those differences. We're going to be doing some data analysis. K-selected, R-selected, I'll be talking about in slides. I want to point out here biotic potential, and that refers to the maximum reproductive rate of a population in ideal conditions. And that's really where the distinctions are made between these two groups of species. We are also going to be talking about how K-selected species are more adversely impacted by invasives than R-selected, and how R-selected species are much more adaptable. And many times invasive species are indeed R-selected. So what are these terms? So K-selected, I want you to think about quality. So their reproductive strategy is to have few offspring, tend to have high parental care, usually reproduce many times during the lifetime. Examples, birds, mammals, usually have a long lifespan, a long time before sexual maturity, usually a very low biotic potential and slow to grow, much more likely to be disrupted by environmental change, disturbances, invasive species. In comparison, R-selected means quantity. So think of quantity. Many offspring, little or no care, may reproduce only once during a lifetime. And examples would be things like fish, some fish species, Probably better would be examples would be insects, many plants like annual plants, short lifespan, quick to sexual maturity, high biotic potential, very rapid population growth rates. More likely to be invasive than K-selected and better suited for rapidly changing environmental conditions. Here's some fun facts. Um, K comes from a German word. I don't Tatsagrini. If you send me an email or send me a video of you pronouncing that word properly, I will give you extra credit. You heard it today. R selected refers to maximum growth rate. So R refers to maximum. That's kind of where these terms come from. So K, carrying capacity. Remember that. And these are quality, so very few offspring. All right, so here's a graph table that shows distinctions between the two in terms of life expectancy, reproduction, time to maturity, number of offspring, size, parental care, and growth rate. So you can take a look at that. Think about our elephant again is K-selected, and an R-selected example here, dandelion. Realize that much like what we talked about generalist and specialist species, there is a spectrum. Some species are very high reproductive rates, like some plants produce lots of seeds, some don't. Things like oysters here can produce 500 million offspring a year with zero parental care. They're just broadcasting those out. And you can see there's a continuum here, fish, frogs, hare, large cat, and then we have a chimpanzee on the other end of the spectrum. Here's some rabbits. So there are exceptions, right, to the idea that all reproductive or all mammal species are K-selected. One could make an argument that rabbits, they can reproduce very quickly. And you could make an argument in many cases that they are more towards the R than the K versus something like an amphibian here. This poison dart frog only has 1 or 2 offspring and does a lot of parental care and carries them on their back, in fact. So remember that it's not, don't put them in the box unless you know. Okay, case selected. So again, we talked about low biotic potential and very hard for them to deal with disturbances. High parental care often means that there is a death. If there's a death of the parent, oftentimes there's a death of the offspring. Invasives can outcompete these K-selected species. Case in point, think of islands like Australia or many of the other Hawaii, where there are specialist species that oftentimes are K-selected species, and they're outcompeted by rodents or other species that are able to make it there and reproduce faster, and have, usually it's a placental mammal versus a marsupial in the case of Australia. So K-selected, less likely to adapt. R-selected, high biotic potential, low parental care. Death of the parent doesn't usually affect them, not as impacted by invasives, more likely to be invasive themselves. They are also oftentimes that early successional species. We've talked about succession earlier, that produces lots of seed and can colonize a new area quite quickly. Because they have so many offspring and in such high rates, they can adapt much quicker and they are much less prone to extinction. All right, now it's your turn again. I'd like you to identify a characteristic of an R-selected species that could increase the likelihood of that species becoming more successful invasive species than a K-selected species. So what's a characteristic of R-selected species which would make it a good invasive species? And describe the biotic potential of one invasive species found in Wisconsin. So do some research, find an invasive species found in the state of Wisconsin. How many offspring do they have? How quickly can they reproduce under maximum conditions? All right, good luck. Okay, here's an example of an invasive. So this is the zebra mussel. It came up in an ed puzzle prior ed puzzle, and the story of the zebra mussel is it was able to get to the Midwest via ballast water. So big ships, when they come out to sea and they're empty, they fill up these tanks so they sit low in the water and they can cross safely. And when they arrive to port, and let's say if they come through the locks of the Great Lakes, they'll empty that water prior to loading up their cargo, say it's steel or coal. And then in that process, they release small either eggs or larvae of different invasive species. And that's kind of how that zebra mussel was able to get to the United States. And from there, it spread to other lakes. You can see that it is, we are receiving and giving in terms of invasives. The northern Pacific sea star, for example, is from Alaska and is able to and has colonized Australia. So invasives get around, and definitely need to monitor these ballast tanks and get better at making sure those invasives are not able to get to new places. All right. Now, I would like you to look at some data. You remember we talked about data analysis. Looking at this data of the native unionid mussel here, and the zebra mussel density, and this is density of number of individuals per meter squared in the Hudson River. So that is kind of at the mouth of the Great Lakes. Describe the relationship between zebra mussel and unionid mussel population density in the Hudson River. So what is the relationship between zebra mussel and this native mussel? All right, last topic for today, the survivorship curves 3.3. We're going to be talking about 3 different types. So we're going to explain those curves. We're going to do some data analysis. You're going to be looking at some graphs today, explain the patterns and trends. And a survivorship curve is a line that represents the relative survival rates of a cohort, a group of individuals of the same age in a population from birth to the maximum age reached. We're going to be distinguished between 3 types, and they are, of course, different in K-selected and R-selected species, which we talked about earlier. So survivorship curve, you can see there's 3 examples. And again, it shows survival of a group, a cohort of a species, the same age species in a population from birth to death. The faster the line drops, the quicker the die-off for those individuals. And if the line is slow to drop, then obviously they're going to have a longer lifespan. So this is a typical graph that you're going to see. So the 3 types. Type 1, mostly these are K-selected species, like that whale, have a high survivorship early in life due to high parental care, high survivorship in midlife because of usually larger size or some sort of defensive behavior. They will, towards the end of their life, have a rapid decrease in survivorship. Examples are most mammals. The one in the middle have a steady decreasing survivorship through life, like those squirrels. So squirrels are, will have maybe, I think they're called pups, and they might have a dozen of those pups, and maybe within a month or so, a couple of them die because of predators or because of something, and then they reach, a couple 6 months or 7 months, a couple of them die, and so on. Type 3, which are mainly the R-selected species, have a high mortality early in life because there's usually no parental care. Think of our fly example. Few make it to midlife, slow, steady decline in survivorship in midlife. Even fewer make it to adulthood. Examples, again, are those insects, fish, and plants. All right, FRQ practice. Here is a graph. Describe the trend in the survivorship shown in this graph, and I'd like you to justify which type of survivorship curve this these data or this data represents. Good luck.